Welcome to the faculty, the students, the administrators, members of the Board of Trustees, former faculty lecturers, and to the family of Joe White, our lecturer for this year. I would just like to make a quick announcement before I introduce our speaker. Following the presentation, there won't be any other acknowledgments or speeches after Joe concludes, but we will have a reception out on the patio. So after you've finished clapping, and those of you that want to come down and wish him well may do that, and then you'll be dismissed. So, I think one of the greatest honors for an individual is to be recognized by his or her peers for professional excellence. Selection as annual faculty lecturer at Santa Barbara City College is that type of honor, an honor that recognizes excellence in the classroom, commitment to the goals and missions of the college, personal and professional contributions beyond the campus community. Joe White exemplifies those characteristics. Joe is a native of Indiana. He attended the University of Evansville, where he earned a bachelor's degree in philosophy and a second bachelor's degree in psychology. Subsequently, he attended the University of Calgary in Alberta, Canada, and the University of California here at Santa Barbara, earning 2 master's degrees in philosophy. Joe began teaching on a part-time basis at Santa Barbara City College in the fall of 1978 and assumed a full-time faculty position with the Department of Philosophy in the fall of 1990. At the college, he has served as department chair. He served on numerous campus committees and as a member of the Academic Senate. In addition, Joe has authored a textbook in political philosophy and has written 5 screenplays and 3 television shows, the majority of which have gone into development. At present, he's the writer-consultant for a 26-part PBS series entitled In Search of Wisdom. Joe's also worked with his colleagues to create the Center for Philosophical Education here at Santa Barbara City College. The center has hosted 2 international conferences and expects to publish the first edition of Stoia, an international journal for undergraduate philosophy students, this spring. Joe is married to Dulcie Sin and is the father of 2 children, Nicholas and Sarah. His parents, his wife and children, and his parents, Paul and Dorothy White from Indiana, are all present here today. This annual faculty lecture was established at Santa Barbara City College 19 years ago as a means for recognizing outstanding classroom teaching and dedicated faculty service to the college. Joe's tenure on this campus has been characterized by an unquenchable thirst for knowledge, enthusiasm for sharing that knowledge in living color, and genuine sensitivity to the needs and concerns of students and colleagues. It's with great pleasure that I present to you our colleague and friend, Joe White.
Well, let the show begin. Hello. Lecture, and I'm extremely gratified all these people showed up for this. So, thanks so much. I wanted to say at the outset here, I was trying to think how to start this off somewhat personally. So I thought, well, there was something that when I was a kid, really young, my mother will recall this, there was kind of saying that went around our household, our family, and it kind of got picked up in my family now, my own family, and it's weird, but it started hearing the similar phrase around even the social science division. I heard this morning actually with Carolyn, and the phrase is, it takes a village to raise. And so, in this context, there's a lot of people here, and if I do it well, if I fall, it's their responsibility. But it's ironic to get this kind of honor because it's just like taking a tapestry, pulling the thread out, and saying, "Well, isn't that nice? Isn't that nice?" I mean, it all fits in together. So I appreciate it, but in some sense, it seems a bit much. I don't know if I deserve it. Now, so thank all of you. What I want to do, and what philosophers have tended to do, and the type of philosophy that I've been educated in, is we tend not to just simply pursue knowledge or just simply try to find the truth, but we tend to talk about these things. So a lot of philosophical talk is on occasion described as meta-talk. Talk about talk, or thinking about thinking. So in that case, what I thought I'd do some meta-lecture remarks. Rather than giving a lecture, I'll just talk about it. So, sooner or later, we'll get to the lecture. But at the outset, let's talk about the lecture. So, in particular, in terms of this lecture, my lecture here, some of you may not know the details of how a faculty member is selected. Is actually selected. I don't either. But what did happen was that you're deceived. You're usually working away, and then someone comes and deceives you. It's usually Alana Rose. And then you're told there's an urgency. You got to show up this meeting and do this. So you show up this meeting. There's a group of people in this meeting, and then they deceive you. And in my case, they lied to me again, said, you've got to go find Alana. I mean, Alana's just right there. I'm going to go find her. So I come back, and then they all go, read the faculty lecture. These people lied to me 2 or 3 times. Suddenly you go, oh, now they're truth tellers. Is that how all this works? Oh, I don't think so. So I'm not quite sure how exactly all of this works. I think I'm on the committee now, so I'll go through this process as well. Now, in terms of the faculty lecture itself, this overall lecture, there is there's an interesting history here, and this is not typically what we do. I think talking to previous lecturers, it's seldom that Michael hasn't been my lecture for a while, whatever, and Peter's usually not there daily, and Carolyn and Jack. I mean, it's supposed to be adults, it's unusual. Do this one, get this one shot, 50 minutes, get actually get a little longer than that, 1 hour. But get in, get out, you got to do this. So this is not what we typically do. Now the thing that struck me at the outset, thinking about this, was like, hey, you got to put all this together, and then I started thinking about this fellow going greatly admire. He's a professional that has just set world-class standards. He's probably a trans-historical figure. And that person is Michael Jordan. I mean, here is an outrageous basketball player. I mean, people who watch this man, he's stunning. He's Hercules on the court. And that's not what bothers me, because I love to watch that. You just thrilled with this man's excellence. It's that baseball career. That's the thing that kind of worries me. He starts off with the White Sox. Fair. That's fair. I mean, he's a great NBA player. Let him start in the majors. Let him start the show. Not batting. Let's go to AAA. Let's see what happens. Let's brush up on some of the details. Didn't work curveballs, sliders. Double A. Mr. Jordan, you'll get it down here. Double A, you'll be okay. Batted 200 if he was lucky. Mediocre fielder. So what worried me was that here you took Michael from the court and put him on the diamond. And I think that what you see here, the previous history of faculty lecturers, you see 18 people who left the court. They left their court and they came to the diamond. And this is the diamond. This is where I play. This is what I do. Right? So they said I didn't have to take this. Yeah, thanks, Corleone. Gary Corleone. Oh, you want to take it. So here, at least we have 18 good years of runs, hits, and home runs. So please, if things don't go well here, look to our past. It's a good past. Now what I want to talk about was just the process of lecturing itself, because that's in part what happened to me is why I got involved with teaching, and particularly in philosophy. And that is when I was probably about my junior year in high school. I had a couple classes, a class in history, I think it was, and a class in Latin, of all things. excitement of leaving what was familiar. There was always danger involved, particularly as I realized when I got to college. I started studying philosophy, because you could really change your mind. That's a possibility. You know? You can have a new thought. Something you hadn't previously thought about before. And maybe something you really held on to, really important to you, it's going to fly. You know what I'm saying? So, there was this sense with some people, that with some of these lectures, that, gosh, you started this process, and the time would go so fast. You know, the lecture time would go fast, or the class time would go fast. And they had this whole sense. And as you went through this notion of uncertainty, risk, and I think the most important part is the notion, at least for me, was that there's a transformation, a change in me that occurred. And the best way I can describe it, at least at the time it was it was just a sense of filling. It was fulfilling, in a sense. It changed me from what I was. I was growing in a profound but subtle way each time I went through these processes. Not that it was always comfortable. Now, in the midst of this, I had these other lecturers that, as I discovered, reading Karl Marx, could easily be described as the alienated. Now, these people showed up for work. You know? It was all important. They had to be there. And oh my gosh, what do we have to do today? It's the clock. Where's my paycheck? And that's exactly what they worked for. Usually for the paycheck, the focus was on the weekend. Oh man, I can't wait for the weekend. Can't wait till we get there. And there's other words that they would use. Words like, I realized this was a mark in time and not something else, the word hump day. And for Wednesday, you know, or TGIF. Thank God it's Friday. These are the alienated. The people who are in a sense not, they just, unfortunately, they don't feel fulfilled, or they don't get something out of what their daily activity is. And Sunday evenings, I'm sure, filled with dread. And Friday morning, they probably suddenly feel a certain exhilaration. It's Friday. Friday. And so they feel better about themselves, but they're alienated. And for the alienated, there's primarily extrinsic value in what they do. They do it mostly for the money, to get on so they can do something else. But I didn't mention, I think, that what I mentioned previously that occurs in the context of adventure is there's intrinsic value to the process. And I think sometimes for the adventure, just being in port, you get nervous. I mean, sometimes you're on holiday. I mean, shouldn't be doing something here. Shouldn't be going here, get on to something else. And so you want to be there. You want to be doing this. Now, what happened in the context of going through education and getting to graduate school was I took a class in philosophy of language. And in that class, we studied speech acts. Now, suddenly here I was studying these speech acts, and in the context of speaking, much like I'm doing today, with theorists in the context of speech acts, and overview here, there's a distinction between the locutionary, the illocutionary, and the perlocutionary act in speaking. Okay? In the context of the locution, the part, what I'm doing, I'm making noises. But I'm making noises in a certain grammar and a certain syntax, let's call it English. I'm making English noises, and it's English noises about certain things in the world. Right? So I'm talking about these different things. We're talking about this. But also what I'm doing is I'm trying to inform you. Right? It's just not a computer up here rattling this off. It's not a tape recorder. I'm trying to inform you. Actually, I want to persuade you. I also want you to be my friend. And then the perlocutionary act is the effect that it's going to have upon you. Okay? Now, for example, I was told just before this happened, amazing how quickly we get this information on the slides. Everyone is ready. All right? There's an English expression. All right? Here's this English expression. And it's about you in this lethal state that you're in. Right? All right? So you're already. Now, when I'm told that, that's also a request to, get your act together, get up. Nobody says get your act together, get up on stage. But that's what comes through. And as a result, I move. Right? So, now I started looking at this. Now, one other thing here is that with these distinctions, Jim Cheshire asked me this question. I was putting this together. He said, well, Joe, what do you think about, what is the locutionary, or in particular, what are the illocution, the perlocutionary aspects of the following act? and the champagne is in the fridge. Jim gave you that example. What's the illocutionary and the locutionary? Now, I'll let you fill that in. You think your way through that. Now, I think the interesting thing that comes out in the context of talking about speech acts, which is what lecturing is all about, and you talk about the alienated and the adventurer, you talk about others. There are faculty that are pilgrims. They're not alienated, but they're pilgrims. And then there's the pure lecturer. But when you talk just in terms of the adventurer and the alienated, I think the locutions end up being the same because the curriculum is pretty uniform. And in terms of the illocutionary act, they're both there to inform, but then I think they start to differ. What you find in the case of the adventurer is there comes off an invitation. There comes off of one of the students to be involved, of the students bringing the students in. And in this context, there's also a sense that, you're expecting a commitment out of all of this, right? In the case of the alienated, oftentimes what comes off is a kind of warning. I don't want to be here. And you don't even have to explicitly say it. It seeps through the language. It bleeds into the language, in a sense. And in this context, then, with the sense of warning or even suggesting, we really don't want to be here. We should be doing something else, shouldn't we? It should be the weekend. We shouldn't be here. We've got to put up with this. That this starts to come through. And so these different aspects, it's the sense of adventure that's always captured me and what I've tried to emulate, tried to model. I think there's a sense that you get involved in the learning experience, and it's not just in the context of philosophy, but it's an attitude about how it is that we teach and learn. And so I think that oftentimes what we miss is that it's not explicit, but it's essentially what one does in saying and by saying something. So I hope to be able to do a bit of that today. These are all my medal questions. And I hope that we can now return to ignorance. And so I hope that I can convey to you this sense that I try to capture when I get involved here in classes with students. So the question came to me at this point, starting. We have such a diverse audience here. We have people from the natural sciences, chemistry, biology, physics, probably even a few people from the social sciences. People I have offices with, from the English departments, from the arts, from all across academia. You ask yourself, what can I say that's kind of to the point, succinct, maybe informative, and relates to all of you? And I thought, man, I don't know, what could a philosopher say? So I started finding, and then, fortunately, the other night, it kind of hit me. And I thought, of course. You're welcome. You're welcome for your PhD. Now that your discipline has a philosophical doctorate, you're at the height of your discipline. We don't have biological doctorates, do we? Or economic doctorates. We have philosophical doctorates. Right? That's what we want to give people. Now, why would we want to give them philosophical doctorates? Well, that's another issue. We'll talk about that in a minute. But everybody gets this. That's how philosophy begins to permeate academia. Okay? And each of these disciplines, when you're given your PhD, it's supposedly because you've made a contribution. It could be something small about jointed legged butterflies mating in the Amazon rainforest, or it could be something huge and big, important, like maybe a third principle of justice or something. So there are all kinds of contributions that can be made, right? But it's supposed to be a contribution. You're supposed to push back the frontier of ignorance and add something to the body of knowledge. That's when you, really a philosopher, you get a PhD. And so it's interesting when you see this relationship then between the collective ignorance and the individual ignorance, right? We're all ignorant of various things. Hopefully, what we'll see is we don't want to be oblivious. When you're oblivious, you don't even know what the question is. But when you're ignorant, it's just a lack of knowledge. Okay, so we'll find that we're all variously different. What each of the individual faculty, it's a huge body. I think there's something interesting today in the information age, and that is as the body of knowledge, collective knowledge, builds, there's this perverse inverse ratio to the individual. We all become more ignorant by the day. Every day, even as we sit here, I'm going, oh man, I'm shrinking even more. I worked so hard to learn so much. I woke up this morning bored here. You know? You just can't keep up. It's so big. It's so vast. Now, the question is, how is it that philosophy has come to play this role in academia? How is it that we get PhDs, philosophical doctors, we're in the academy, we're academics, all of that stuff? Well, I think it basically comes down to attitude. And I don't mean this in some old classical sense. I mean this in South Central LA streets, right? There's an attitude that's come down through the ages, right? And this attitude in philosophy, I think, can be clearly seen if we contrast it with what's sometimes called a religious attitude. Okay? So, in the context of religion, what I was going to do is read to you from Genesis and look at this book in particular because it touches upon Christianity and Judaism and Islam, a big part of the world's population. But you'll see how this relates to philosophy. My big book. Actually, the only little page that look more impressive. So let me read to you a moment. Genesis, chapter 2, verses 15 to 25, and chapter 3, verses 1 to 24. This translation is from the original tongues, being the virgin set forth in 1611 A.D., Anno Domini, the year of the Lord. The Lord God took the man and put him in the Garden of Eden to till and keep it. And the Lord God commanded the man, saying, You may freely eat of every tree of the garden, but of the tree of knowledge of good and evil you shall not eat, for the day that you eat of it you shall die. Then the Lord God said, It is not good that the man should be alone. I shall make him a helper, fit for him, etc., etc., etc. Along comes man, Eve. Chapter 3. Now the serpent was more subtle than any other creature that the Lord God had made. He said to the woman, Did God say, You shall not eat of any tree of the garden? And the woman said to the serpent, We may eat of the fruit of the trees of the garden, but God said, You shall not eat of the fruit of the tree which is in the midst of the garden. Neither shall you touch it, lest you die. The serpent then said to the woman, For the Lord God knows that when you eat of it, your eyes will be opened, and you will be like God, knowing good and evil. So when the woman saw that the tree was good for food, and that it was a delight to the eyes, and that the tree was to be desired to make one wise, she took of its fruit and ate, and she also gave some to her husband, and he ate. Then the eyes of both were opened, and they knew that they were naked. Not a big insight, but it's okay. And they saw fig. They didn't see them. They sewed fig leaves together and made aprons. That was the translation. And I guess they put them on. So, and they heard the sound of the Lord walking in the garden in the cool of the day, and the man and his wife hid themselves from the presence of the Lord God among the trees of the garden. But the Lord God called the man and said to him, Where are you? And he said, I heard the sound of thee in the garden, and I was afraid, because I was naked. I hid myself. He said, Who told you you were naked? Have you eaten of the tree which I commanded you not to eat? The man said, I'll tell you. The man said, The woman who thou didst, she gave me fruit of the tree, and I ate. Now, think. That's the locution. What is the illocutionary act here? Blame. I'm a victim. What's the request? Punish her. Right? Then the Lord God said to the woman, What is this that you have done? The woman said, The serpent beguiled me, and I ate. Illocutionary force, blame the serpent. Perlocution, request, turn perlocution, punish the serpent. I wonder why we don't take responsibility. How far back does this go? So, here you have a story, an old story from an ancient text, about man's relationship to gaining knowledge of the good. Now, there's an interesting correlate to this in Aristocles' work. People familiar with Aristocles? maybe you know him by Plato. Plato, I mean, sometimes you only know Sting as Sting or Madonna as Madonna. They just know Plato as Plato. But anyway, I'll call him Plato. Plato wrote a book called The Republic, but other dialogues as well. And in The Republic, there's a section called the allegory of the cave. In the allegory of the cave, Plato describes these people who are at the bottom of this cave for their whole life, only looking at this wall. They don't see anything else. Behind them is a fire, and between the fire and their backside walk these other people carrying all these objects that cast shadows. Okay, variously cast shadows. And so these people live in this bottom of this cave, and they think that's the world. They think that's reality. All these shadows, all these noise. Suddenly, one of them is set free. Doesn't get free himself. Doesn't rattle the chains, doesn't take it off. Is set free and dragged out. Right? Dragged out into the light. His eyes. So when you read these two stories, there's an awful lot about sight, an awful lot about eyes, about seeing, about the good. And what happens then, the person comes out, and for Plato, the sun outside represents the good. This is the point of life for the Greeks. Dragged out of the cave, see the good, get knowledge of the good. Or as Socrates says to Glaucon, this part, every feature in this allegory, my dear Glaucon, is meant to fit our earlier discussion. The prison dwelling corresponds to the region revealed to us through the sense of sight. The ascent out of this cave to see the things in the upper world you take as standing for the upward journey of the soul into the region of knowledge. Now, I forgot to. This is a little summary of the Genesis. I don't often use this, so. All right, here's where we should be. In the world of knowledge, the last thing to be perceived, and only with great effort, is the idea of goodness. Once it is perceived, the conclusion must follow that for all things, this is the cause of whatever is right and good. Without having had a vision of goodness, one cannot act with wisdom. Then, when the prisoner calls to mind her fellow prisoners and what passed for wisdom in her former dwelling place, she would surely think herself happy in the change and be sorry for them. She would far sooner endure anything rather than go back to her old beliefs and live in ignorance. Now we have contrasting views here. Should we get knowledge of goodness? Should we get knowledge of goodness? Should we be punished for it? Should we be punished for it? So, there's an interesting twist, I think, to this story. Think of it this way. Try to imagine the Garden of Eden. Beautiful garden. Probably not unlike either this one. Wonderful spirit, wildness, right? And suppose there's a wall around this garden. Picture Socrates climbing the wall. Okay? This old dude in this toga is trying to climb over the wall. Gets over the wall, makes a beeline to the tree of knowledge and good and evil. That's the philosopher. He's going to go there. He's going to shake that tree. He's going to shake all the apples off the tree. Pretty soon you're going to have apple pie. You're going to have cobblers. You're going to have turnovers. You're going to have all kinds of apples. And then Eve, on that momentous afternoon, when she walked along, was there some Freudian snake beguiling her? No. There was the smell of applesauce and cinnamon. And she walks over, and who's standing there? But that little snub-nosed Greek in his apron. Those wore aprons, I guess. Wearing aprons, saying, "Hey, babe, check out the apples here." Now, he's giving it out because that's the point for the philosopher, is to gain wisdom, to gain knowledge of good and evil. And so then we can imagine, now what's going to happen? God comes along. Now, try to picture, can you picture God walking through the garden? I don't know. But try to think about it. Here he comes walking through the garden. What's the first thing he's going to say to Socrates? "You eat my apples." He sounds like the tree in the Wizard of Oz story. "Don't you know my command? I commanded you not to eat those apples." Now we say, well, what's Socrates going to do now? We know exactly what he would do. Plato wrote about it in the Euthyphro. Socrates is going to say, "God, would you please tell me, are your commands right because you command them, or do you command them because they're right?" raising questions people, maybe humanity had never thought of before. Because I bet if we took a survey here, most everybody here has heard of this man. And how has he lived so long in our history? It's because of this. That's why he's the patron of philosophy. There are these questions. You know, why this? Why that? And finally comes the point where he's told, you are indeed the wisest man of Athens. Duh! How could I be the wise? I don't know anything. That became the source of his wisdom. He knew, he didn't know. But the interesting thing, I think, is, in this context, what he did know were the questions. He knew questions that most of us hadn't even thought of. And he knew the questions. This was part of his genius, his brilliance. He may not have known the answer. And it took a bit longer for philosophy to develop epistemology, a theory of knowledge, which answers are acceptable. But the questions themselves are the instigators. The questions get the process going. If you don't have a question, then you're oblivious. So you've got to get the questions going. And when talking about the questions, what we find is that as human beings have become more self-conscious and more reflective, we realize, well, there are questions and there are questions. Now, sometimes people say, well, scientists are concerned with the what's and the hows, and philosophers are concerned with the whys. But it's not that simple, right? It's not that easy because you can ask the same question, the why or what form. So that's not going to cut it. But there are interesting distinctions between asking for a justification and asking for an explanation. And a large part of science, though not an exhaustive part of science, but a large part of science is concerned with explaining. When we explain, we start with what we take to be the truth. So if, for example, you're working in a mental hospital and somebody comes along and says, yes, I am Napoleon Bonaparte, and I did indeed wipe out Wellington and all his people. You know? So you're Napoleon. Well, cool. You know, anybody else? Yes, that I've been here, you know, I left Elba not so long ago. This guy's a nut. You know, it's 1998. He thinks he's Napoleon. Then you go to the psychiatrist, why is that fellow? You know, he get this wonderful explanation about his neurotransmitters misfiring and too much of something and a tumor here and everything. That gives us an explanation why this person thinks they're Napoleon. Does that give us any justification to believe that it is true that they're Napoleon? No. These are different activities. Justification and explanation. There are good explanations. There are good justifications. We'll see. There are bad justifications as well. But you have to draw this distinction because sometimes when we get into certain areas, particularly very sensitive areas, say where you, and I find this with my students, where you ask a question like, why do you believe in God? That's a very important question. And they say, well, that's the way I was raised. That's an excellent explanation. That's a lousy justification. That doesn't give you any justification for the truth of your belief, but it explains why you believe it, in the way in which we can explain why children believe in Santa Claus. But those explanations won't provide justification. Now, the interesting thing, too, that's happened, we'll talk about in a moment here in terms of the more modern period, is that explanations themselves have changed over the course of our history as a civilization. At one time, for example, you take the mid-14th century when the bubonic plague hit Europe. In 1340 or so, we hear a third of the European population is being wiped out. They knew it was coming. It came out of the trade routes of the Middle East. I mean, people weren't oblivious to this. This is a horrible, dark time. People are dying horribly. Why? Well, the human understanding then was permeated with certain religious beliefs. So it became, obviously, given the description we had of the deity, it must have been his intention. And we were being punished. We did something wrong. What do we do? How do we change this? We must pray more. We must give sacrifices. A few hundred years go by. Say, why are these plagues coming? Well, it's actually a causal relationship here between the saliva and rats. The bacteria and these are the saliva and fleas, and these fleas riding on these rats. I mean, this causal explanation now for the same phenomenon. Is a rainbow the sign of a covenant? Or is that suspended water drop reflecting? All these other, why do women have pain in childbirth? Scientific or divine? We've shifted. When we shifted in our explanations, the natural causal explanations grew in power, continued to grow, pushing out the other. Part of the adventure and the excitement of the 20th century is seeing, how's this going to work itself out? Is there anything needed in the first? Is it all the latter? How does this exactly work? We'll talk about one of the features of this in a minute. Now, as we look this over, we ask ourselves that, well, this is in terms of the question. How the question configures or shapes the answers. And you can see in the second case, you don't even talk about divine intention. But what about the answer itself? Now, this is pretty interesting, because I think we've gotten to a point in our culture, at least right now, where I've described my students in part as being members of the epistemic democracy. We've taken a wonderful political notion, democracy, equality, participation, everything, and we've stuck it in the epistemological category in terms of knowledge. Somehow now, this may be one of the principles, we hold all beliefs to be self-evidently true, and that each of us has been endowed with certain beliefs that we really believe, and therefore they're true. That's not going to work that way. Who cares if you really believe it? That just might mean you're a fanatic. Right? We're concerned with, is the belief true? Do you know the belief? Do you know that that belief is true? And actually, this talk about belief may be a bit off as well, but we can't go into what beliefs are about at this time. So, we have to ask ourselves, have we gotten into some notion of epistemic democracy? It's just whatever you believe. Yeah, it's your belief, it's your belief. Now, in the context of class, I usually don't use a term like epistemic democracy because I don't think it sticks with the students very well. And so you sometimes have to find other words in order to convey the same idea. So what we talk about there are intellectual sluts. And people who will sleep with any idea. So, but I think in this particular group, if we talk about epistemic democracy, I think that might catch the same thing. Now, it's funny that people believe these things. I mean, they have all these weird beliefs. They think, oh, they believe it is okay. But when we look through our own culture, through anthropology, and I'm talking about Tom Jones, we find that sometimes we pull up, we hold off. So, for example, most of us have passed through this period, usually at least by the time you're 13 or 14 years old, where you don't believe in Santa Claus anymore. You know, and you have this whole talk about, don't tell your little brother the truth. You know, he thinks that, he doesn't know the naughty truth and all this, because Santa Claus is real. Now, that's within a culture, and it's cute, but there's this group that I was recently reading about called the Wawaro. They live in Venezuela, on a small river there, and have this interesting view that the Earth, and it's just 1990s, the Earth is shaped like a saucer, and around the Earth swims this giant snake, and below it lives this four-headed dragon. I don't think so. I mean, that's okay. They can have that. It's not true. But they can have it. That could be. I respect them. That's not the truth. You know, I don't think so. Nobody saw that on the NASA photo or anything. We're supposed to build this space station this summer. Oh my God! But the monster gives them. Now you look at. Now I want to tell you about Saddam Jones. There never was anybody named Saddam Jones that I know of, but there was a young man, a little kid, 3.5 years old, that I read about in the early 1980s. 1990, so 17 years or so I've been carrying this around. It bothered me. And what happened, I put the name Saddam up here, and I left the name Jones is up there because it's not about the culture, it's not about the particular religion, it's about a certain view, and I think it covers the world's religions. We'll leave it at that. And what happened here was, what happened is in a small community, and 3.5-year-old Saddam Jones had taken something from another child, and he's supposed to give it back. Ever so reluctantly gave it back. He wouldn't apologize. So the holy man of this group, I won't identify any further, told his parents that corporal punishment was what would really help this case here and teach this boy a lesson. So they had his mother hold this boy, and then the father proceeded to spank him with this wooden paddle. After an hour, the boy died of internal bleeding. And they took him to the hospital. He was turned out dead. And at that point, they said, the doctor said, why did you do? when you take what's gone on in philosophy and all the different disciplines and you start talking about knowledge, it's more than just belief, as we see. You've got to have more than just belief. That just gets it going. So let's back up a little bit. Let me ask you this. I think when I started this lecture, Bill Clinton was president. Is that still the case? Is he still president? Okay. And so when I started, he was president. Now, does anybody know Mr. Clinton personally? Anybody good, close personal friend? Hillary? Monica? So, let me ask you something personal about Bill. And see if you know this about Bill. Does anybody here know if Bill is a U.S. citizen? Well, of course you got. That's not right. Well, you think, yes, Bill is a U.S. citizen, but how do you know that? Well, all U.S. presidents are U.S. citizens. Bill's a U.S. president. Therefore, Bill's a U.S. citizen. You reason, right? You stacked your beliefs in a certain way. And in this process, this activity of reasoning, you come to believe that it is true that Bill is a U.S. citizen, but you don't know him personally. There are all different kinds of ways of stacking this. I mean, one of the first philosophers to look at the stacking process itself was Aristotle. And become very, very powerful, our knowledge of stacking here in the late 20th century. But that you have to justify. Justification is the activity of giving reason to show the truth, right? To come to know. So, how about these? Is this the right stack? All U.S. presidents are U.S. citizens. Joe White's a U.S. citizen, therefore Joe White's a U.S. president. No, not a good stack. Right? It's not stacked. It's actually known as the fallacy undistributed middle. How about if you stack it like this? Well, all U.S. presidents are U.S. citizens. Bill Clinton is a U.S. citizen, therefore Bill Clinton. All the individual claims are true, but it's still not stacked right. It's stacked the same way the first one is stacked. It's a bad stack. There's a fallacy there. Now, if you're concerned about stacking, if you're concerned about reasoning and understanding good justification, then I'd encourage you to take either English 111 or Philosophy 110. And you can start to study, at least at that level, informal logic and learn about stacking. Or you can take Philosophy 205, which is a little more advanced, more symbolic logic, but actually learn about what is the right kind of stacking. Now, I have a lot of intuitions about how to stack, and I can give you an argument and just let you fill in the conclusion and see if this is a good stack. What follows? All philosophy instructors are drag queens. Oh, never mind. Now what you have, forgot about that. Shelley left that in. Where's Shelley? So, in the case of not falling into epistemic democracy, but actually being in a position of epistemic privilege through the centuries, the traditional definition, though it may not be adequate ultimately, but the traditional definition concerns justified true belief. Knowledge is complex. It consists of components. And you have to have all of those components before you actually have knowledge. And knowing a belief is true is very different from the belief being true. So when we go through this, particularly what we'll see when we talk about science is science usually takes truth for granted. They start with certain phenomena, the rings of Saturn, whatever. And occasionally they will discover new truths, but they don't give, science doesn't give us theories of truth. That's still within the domain of philosophy. Science has to take that for granted. They have to just assume that it works in a certain way. And it's for philosophers to figure out. And there are interesting distinctions between mathematical truths, which seem to be necessary, and the way in which scientific truths are only contingent. So there are interesting questions to be raised about truth, and that has traditionally remained within the area of philosophy. Now, you take this and you go back to where we were, you see that what's missing in the case of Santa Claus is true belief. I mean, it's true the kids had some justification. After all, most of their siblings, their parents, strangers in malls lied to them. You know? It's a conspiracy to get you to believe this. But, alas, the belief is false. So they don't know. There's nothing about an elephant. There's certainly a four-headed dragon below the saucer of the earth. These are false. But what about Saddam Jones? What about this butt business is the problem. And so this has been one of the intriguing problems of philosophy, which has remained in philosophy, and for some time we thought would actually be taken over by science, but that didn't turn out to be successful. Now, what seems to go on here, most of the world's religions, though logically they may not have to, but at least the tradition has been, that they've ended up resting upon a dualistic foundation. That is, most of the world's religions. That includes Christianity, Judaism, Hinduism, Buddhism, Confucianism. They assume that we are largely made up of two parts. There's my body, and then there's my soul, my spirit. And my body makes my spirit can make my body move in various ways. Like you can say, Joe, raise your right hand. I didn't say it was smart. I just said it. Right? Joe, raise your left hand, you know? Complicated things. Walk backward. Okay? So that's supposed to be what my spirit, my soul, my mind, cause my body. I'm two things. And reality consists of two things. There are the physical things, there are stools, and there are angels, maybe, or whatever, fairies, whatever, in that sense. So there are two realms, two parts to reality. Now, interestingly, for the last 400 years, another view has grown up. But it's not clear that science need rest on this, but it's certainly been the common sense assumption that there's just one thing. We live in a universe, not a multiverse, a universe. And there's one thing, the stuff, whatever it ultimately ends up being, but it's one thing. And it comes together in various ways, but it's one thing. Sometimes it's referred to as materialism or physicalism. This doesn't exhaust the possibilities, but these are probably the two more popular. Now you ask yourself, where do you come in? You probably come into one of these two categories. The interesting thing is they both cannot be true. They could both be false, so they cannot both be true. So we have a collision in systems. Now, what also happens in the case of dualism, let's look at that for a moment. Here's the traditional view. The way it's come down to us, largely from Descartes, for those of you who know Descartes. We have mind. The mind is an inflow. We describe it. It is thinking. It is not spatial. And depending upon the culture, there's some non-essential add-ons that you get. Like it survives the death of the body, retains its identity, maybe even it's immortal. Right? Some people have claimed that, that when you die, you approach the bright light. You've heard this before. That could just be a big soul zapper. Like those little lights around the insects. Anyway, holy, right? That didn't last long. And for some reason, there's no body, but it's still capable of being punished or being rewarded. And in some different cultures, it's even capable of being reincarnated. Now, the body is different. The body is a physical thing. It is, in a sense, public, and it's said to be spatial. It's non-spatial, what is spatial? Now, that's been interesting. It's dominated for quite a while, and it still is popular within the culture. In academia, it probably started dying in about the 18th century. I mean, it underwent some terrible time. But by the 18th century, when David Hume came along and said, I don't think there's anything so substantial as the soul, well, there were some problems. And then, what seemed to follow us through history was what's sometimes described as the fatal flaw. Where do these two interact? Where does my mind start to affect my body? Well, how could something that's non-spatial be someplace? How could there be a where here? So, that doesn't seem to make sense. It seems to be maybe like asking, is Tuesday taller than a toaster? It's nonsense. So now what I'm going to do? I mean, science is continuously growing. Growing. And by the 20th century, behaviorists say, let the dark box go. You don't need the mind. That's all that spiritual superstition stuff. Let's get into the 20th century here. Let's follow the materialist route. It must, after all, have something to do with the brain. The eyeball. Right? There's got to be something going on here in terms of our thinking. And so what we do is we start tracing it down. We look, boy, do we get sophisticated. Look at this. That's pretty nice. I like the eyeball, all the details. Whoa, neurons. Check out the neurons. Look, synaptic gap, neurotranslated. Oh, man, look at this neuron directing. Over 100 billion neurons in the brain. Gee, Christmas. And look, this is the effect of the drug. basic story, electromagnetic radiation stimulates our sensory surface to a sufficient level that our retina is stimulated, cones rod stimulated, the optic nerve is stimulated, all those drugs. And then we have these little pictures in the back of our head. Is that true? We have two little pictures. No, you don't have two pictures. You just have one picture. You don't have any pictures. There are no pictures in your head. Where would those pictures be? Who's looking at them? So, what's this stuff about pictures? What do neurons and all this neuron firing, all this wonderful stuff, what does it have to do with our experience? Well, we are. Now there seems to be this problem. Problem of qualia. Right? The last one we showed, oftentimes you still see this in books where they show, the pictures in our head. And we describe ourselves as having dreams, which are images. I mean, people think, well, I got up this morning, man, I had this very vivid dream. Now, my parents are staying with me. Man, my mother was chasing me on the edge of the Grand Canyon trying to hit me with wooden spoons, I had this very vivid dream. Pictures in my mind. Yeah, right. But film going through your head? No, nothing like that. So, if science, in terms of simple brain processes, if thoughts aren't just brain processes, that's all they are, then we have to reconceive ourselves. We don't dream at night. Where are the colors? Gerald Jacobson at the Neuroscience Institute at UCSB said in a recent article, colors are an illusion. Well, where do they exist? I mean, we know about the molecular structure of objects and how certain pigments will reflect and absorb and all this stuff, and how neural electric magnetism, we know the whole story. Where's blue? Where is that? Is it in the synaptic gap? Is it in a neuron column? Is it in a neural net? Is it subneural? Blue. Where is blue? How do we have these kinds of experiences? How do dreams exist? Where are you? Now, one of the interesting theories in contemporary talk has to do with emergent properties. What is emerging here? Are we tossed back to another form of dualism? What is most intimate to us, we do not understand. We do not know. And so here we are. What is closest to us is the very frontier of ignorance. We don't quite understand what this is. But I think all the knowledge that we gather, all the insight that we have, is probably not what is of utmost importance to us. I think what's probably of utmost important to us has to do with what we evaluate, how we value. And what happens is we realize, I think it's true, that all value judgments, our moral judgments, is false. That's not a true statement. You don't determine that in a lab. You look at different cases, you see that human beings are capable of evaluating their reality in different ways. You might come out of here and say, man, that lecture that I just heard, that sucked. I don't know if that's a moral judgment. I don't think it's a moral judgment. You might say, but you did have on a nice shirt. Sure, cool. That's not a moral judgment. This microphone, Tony, I think it sucks. What's wrong with that? That's not a moral judgment. So, suddenly we realize, whoa, we make all these different types of value judgments. What is morality? What is it to judge morally? And oftentimes I find, at least with my students, they confuse these two questions. What is morality and why be moral? Very different. And I think in the case of why be moral, suddenly you might ask, well, what do you mean here? Why should we be moral? It's probably some pretty good self-interested reasons to be why we should be moral. Probably a pretty good reason why I should be moral over the course of my lifetime, perhaps. And psychologically, it may vary. If I was Jeffrey Dahmer, I might have a different view. But Charles Manson. But overall, being me, I think it's primary. Why should I be moral on this particular occasion when I will not get caught and I can get away with this and have a good time? I don't know. I'm not sure about that. We have to talk about that and see. But that's a different question from asking, what is morality? And morality, by whatever name, a kind of consensus, I think, that has developed, is that this is a way that we attempt to evaluate our lives where we show respect for each other. There's a sense here where we recognize some element of equality. There should be something impartial in our evaluation, as opposed to, say, dealing simply with our self-interest. That's about me. That's about what's in it, about me. And there's some wonderful cases in which that should dominate, maybe like coming today. I don't think anybody here is under a moral obligation to show up. And you may find that it didn't even turn out to be in your self-interest to be here. But that may be what had brought you here, right, initially. But it's not a moral issue. And I tried to get the law changed to make sure everybody showed up, but they said it wasn't a legal concern. So, when we think about morality, I think that the notions of respect, some sense of equality amongst creatures, this happens. But not every creature belongs to the moral community. Probably many of you wiped out snails this morning, killed mosquitoes. Those things don't belong. But there's a sense in which, and we're having a hard time now, people are about animals, dolphins belong, humpback whales, and all this. And all this debate. How about fetuses? That's very important for the abortion debate. What gets included? What gets the rights? What gets the respect? What gets the impartiality? How do we evaluate our lives that way? And reasoning has a lot to do with all of this. There's a role for reasoning to play. So when I was trying to think of an example we could talk about, everything going on in the newspaper in Washington and all of that, I initially thought about talking about capital punishment. Everybody hears the debate. So I tried to think about something that there might be some difference of opinion, something that might kind of strike us in a certain way. So I tried to think of something pink. So the question is homosexuality wrong? Here's a traditional argument that's often put up. Well, the purpose of cloaked sex, reproduction. Homosexuality violates that purpose function. Any act that violates something function is wrong. Therefore, homosexuality is wrong. Overall, we could look at the structure. It's pretty good stacking. I think if my students are correct, the first one is glaring. They go, huh? What are you talking about? I won't tell you what they tell me, right? But that's not what they list as the function of the purpose, right? It ranges from exercise to manipulation to all sorts of things. Now, is it a good argument? Well, in terms of its structure, it's okay. But it has false premises. And given those false premises, somebody who accepts the conclusion, right, the claim is wrong, faces a question about the rationality of their beliefs. Are you a bigot? Have you simply been socialized with a certain position, and you really have no justification for that belief? Should you now change your mind? Are you tossed into a state of ignorance and now have to re-examine and rethink? Is there something else? Is there another argument? A better argument? But you got to play a certain game. You got to stack your beliefs in a certain way and look at it in a certain way. Now, it's interesting because at this point in 1998, don't think Lois Capps has advocated anything like slavery. I mean, that's not our platform. That's not what's going on in 1998. Nobody's getting that. Women's suffrage. I mean, come on, you've had to vote for what? 70-something years. So, that's not an issue. Jump 75 years ahead. I suspect the abortion debate will be over. I think right now, if you went through the literature, started reading, especially what philosophers are doing, they're probably 20 years ahead of the public debate in some ways. And so, people just have to catch up. And as the old saying has it, one century's philosophy is the next century's common sense. And now we're in the midst of these debates. And race and gender, we'll past that. We'll grow out of that. There won't be any of those funny people with those white hats in the next century. Maybe the problems of speciesism will still be with us. But let me ask you this. Here we are. Let's look at 1/28, 2073, 3 o'clock, right about this time. Where will we be on that day, ordinary day? Right here? Most of us won't. Most of us between now and then have a very precise moment where it's all going to end. It's all going to be over. And in the context of looking at that, I think that moment's inevitable. Yeah, it could be 2015, Michael shot my banker, or something, I don't know. We all have our moment. All have our moment, it's coming, and hopefully it'll be good. Hopefully you'll live long. You'll be 80, 90 years old or whatever, in a nice, quiet spot, laying there. Just wake up, and you'll look out, maybe your great grandkid will be there wiping his slobber. Wake up, Grandma! Whoa, hello. You wake up, and you look outside. It's a beautiful day, another beautiful day. You walk out here, you can see blue sky, smell, taste. But at that moment, you'll know that this is your last one. There will not be another. You probably won't make it to lunch. There will not be a dinner that day. It's over. The whole thing is over. And what we want to ask ourselves at that moment, can we look back and say, it was a good life. It was a good life. This is a 20-year-old, 25-year-old female approximately. That's how we'll spend most of our time, isn't it? This is our future. And so, when we look back, we say, yeah, it was good. We're not talking about a moment of joy, a moment of pain. We're talking about the whole thing. The whole thing. We'll experience the whole gamut of emotion, the whole gamut of feelings. We'll have been on this adventure to learn and think and all of that. And when we look back, will we be able to say, I think, this way, Aristotle always struck me as interesting on this. Was our life filled with eudaimonia? Was it a good life? And I think when Aristotle says that eudaimonia is that activity of the soul in accordance with virtue, we won't have a chance to go into all the virtue stuff. It's the truncated tour, the short tour. There's something important about the activity part of it, which sometimes eludes us. Oftentimes, many of us think that, well, if I only had this, if I only had that, if I only had this, if I only had that, well, was that going on a Ferrari? Then I'd be really happy. New tires. If I had that, the stuff. If I get the stuff, I get the stuff. But I think what he's claiming here is it's not what, it's how. It's how you live, not what you have. Right? And in that, what we oftentimes see with people is that they always think, well, if I have it, then in the future, like next year, I'll be happy. It's going to happen to me this next year. That gets better. This is it right now. And I think if there's some element of misery right now, it'll be there forever. You can't buy your way out of it. It's here. It's here to stay. So when you think about the quality of life, it has to be today. It has to be now. It has to be looked at in its dailiness. So, I think the point maybe is captured best by Eliot, when he said, "We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all of our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time." I think that that's largely what education, in particular philosophy, can do for us. It lets us see the familiar in grand eyes. We see it like we haven't seen it before. And the world is a different place for the educated as opposed to the uneducated. So I'd like to close with reading to you something here that appeared in the New York Times this last December. The New York Times did a survey of graduate students from Princeton University in the class of 1977. Mr. J.M. Bemke, 42, who was a 1977 graduate of Princeton University, a major in philosophy, did what so many philosophy majors do. He became a lawyer. But he built a career with a twist. After a few years in corporate law, Mr. Bemke moved to American wine country and became the chief financial officer at a winery. He then opened a law practice in Sonoma County, California, representing the vineyards. Quote Mr. Bemke, "Some days, I'm sorry I didn't go on as a philosopher, but I do have a fantasy. I have a fantasy of